Thank you. It's very nice to be here. So I'm going to tell you a few stories about the art of storytelling, but I would like to start with a personal anecdote. When I was a child, at some point, I developed a strange habit. Every 15 minutes or 20 minutes or so, I would put my hands on my shoulders and pat gently, just checking, trying to understand if there was anything there. This happened around the time I was 7 years old. My parents had got divorced, and that summer I spent half of the summer with my paternal grandmother in one city in Turkey, and the remaining half of the summer with my maternal grandmother in another city. And I can't recall which one of these two women told me this, but by the end of the summer, I had learned that everything I did, thought, or felt in life was meticulously recorded. I learned that according to Islam, there were two angels sitting on the shoulders of each and every person. And these angels worked 24 hours, 7 days. So the angel on our right shoulder wrote down, recorded every good deed, but also thoughts, feelings, emotions, even dreams. And the angel on the left shoulder wrote down every sinful thought that crossed our minds, every sin and peccadillo that we committed. The names of these angels was interesting to me. They were called Kiraman Katibin, which means the honorable scribes, the noble recorders. There was a clerk on our street, and I remember he was a quite taciturn man. I remember looking at him closely, trying to understand if there was some mystery there, because he was a scribe of sorts. It intrigued me, what did it mean to be a scribe? What did it mean to be a writer? What did it mean to dedicate your entire life to the written word? The whole thing fascinated me. It also paralyzed me. I would go to the bathroom often to check the mirror, to see if I could spot the angels in the changing light. But more than the angels or the scribes, I think it was the idea of living with two books on our shoulders that really, really intrigued me. What was written in those books about me, about you, about each and every one of us? And how fascinating it was that there wasn't only one book, but two books. And that meant even the same person could be interpreted from two different angles. Maybe it meant that there was no such thing as being absolutely good or absolutely bad. The only problem was, it bothered me that the angel who recorded the bad things was associated with the left shoulder, with the left arm. I was left-handed. And in late 1970s, in these small Muslim neighborhoods throughout Turkey, I would say, many left-handed children were constantly criticized and converted to right-handed because people thought that was wrong. So either in the family or at school, they were converted, and that's exactly what happened to me. Even though I was quick and eager to learn how to read, when it came to writing, to learn how to write, I was one of the slowest in the classroom, and it took me a long time to be able to write. Even to this day, there's a gap between my brain and my handwriting. And gaps are important to me. As you will notice throughout this talk, I will be mentioning gaps quite often. Later on, you might be familiar with this saying. When I read these words that are widely attributed to Thomas Aquinas, it made me stop and think that period in my life. The saying goes like this: beware of the person of one book. Or sometimes it's translated as like this: I'm afraid of the person of one book. I remember reading this and thinking, if I can bring the Christian tradition and the Islamic tradition together for a minute, what does it mean to be, a person of one book? Why should we be scared of the person of one book? Does this mean that, what person of one book means? Someone who looks at the world from only one perspective, who has only one book, one sacred book, one worldview, and nothing else? Perhaps, but it could also be interpreted in a different way by bringing these two traditions together. Maybe it can be interpreted as someone who has only one book on one shoulder, someone who likes to think of himself as someone who is completely good, someone who reads the world in terms of black and white. In other words, someone who thinks of the world in one dimension, in only a single dimension. It could mean that someone who is intolerant of multiplicity, plurality. I think all extremist ideologies, whether it's racism, Hungarian ultranationalism, German ultranationalism, Islamic extremism, or Christian extremism, they share one thing in common. They're all asking us, choose your story. And choose your story means, at the same time, choose your side. Once you know your story, stick to your story. And there's an assumption that we cannot have multiple stories, multiple belongings as human beings. That is the basic assumption that all extremist ideologies share. But there's no such thing as the story. Instead, there are stories within stories within stories, constantly interconnecting us, constantly shifting, like the stories of Shehrazad in 1001 Nights. Every writer knows that in order to build a story, you need diversity. You cannot write a book or a story based on sameness. And if we believe that God is the biggest storyteller, then we can think that the universe needs diversity, differences, in order to move on. Books are our companions of the road. They are witnesses to the journeys we pass through as individuals, nations, and as humanity. And today, books themselves are going through an enormous transformation, a transformation that surprises many of us, but also scares many of us. And it leads to discussions such as the death of the book, the death of the novel, or sometimes the death of knowledge and wisdom in the age of the digital age. There is no doubt that the invention of the printing machine was one of the most crucial turning points in human history. So 1450, Germany. To me, it is remarkable that it expanded so fast, so quickly. It is remarkable that the books of Luther, Erasmus, were printed in hundreds of thousands, not after they died, but while they were living in their lifetime. But what we fail to talk about is what happened afterwards, the geographical gap, the cultural gap that opened up after the invention of the printing machine. Printing was introduced in the Islamic world, not in 15th century, not in 16th century, not in 17th century, but in the 18th century. In 1729, the first printing machine was established in Istanbul, in my hometown, and there was a lot of opposition, mostly from the ulema, from the religious men, but also from the calligraphers who didn't want to lose their jobs. It was shut down. 50 years later, it was opened up again in 1779. But let's be optimistic and let's stick to the first date, so 1729. When I put those two dates side by side, 1450, Gutenberg, printing machine, and 1729, Ibrahim Müteferrika, the printing machine, there's almost a 300 years gap in between. And I do believe that many of the problems that we face today is connected to that gap. But I'm not claiming that while printing was going ahead in Europe, in the Western world, I'm not claiming that the Islamic world was stagnant or monolithic or it was not moving forward. It was also throbbing with ideas. It was also throbbing with creativity and differences. The problem was these were not reflected in written culture. So there was another gap within the Islamic world between oral culture and written culture. And the biggest problem was in the long run, to make books, the written word, accessible to millions of people. This is a challenge that is still very relevant today. For me, one other challenge is how to help stories to circulate freely and equally around the world. Because when I look at the book industry, especially in the UK and the USA, the amount of translated books, the percentage of translated books is like 3 to 4% of the entire book market. Whereas when I look at the Turkish market, between 45 and 53% of the books are translated from European languages. Now, what does that mean? It means there's a one-way road. It means the readers in the non-Western world read Western ideas, Western books or literature, more than Western readers read non-Western ideas. And I think this is a gap that we should be thinking about, we should be worrying about. Overall, we are witnessing 4 massive changes in the world of books. The first change is taking place in publishing. Until a few years ago, just until quite recently, there were very gloomy predictions that because of the introduction of the expansion of e-books, the printed book was going to disappear, right? Slowly but surely it was going to wither away. And there was also another gloomy prediction that because we were living in such a fast-moving age, nobody was going to have time to read novels anymore. And none of those predictions have been actualized so far. There are 6 major publishers, and all 6 of them are making profits today more than they used to in the past. But this shouldn't deceive us. At the same time, many bookshops are losing, many bookshops are closing down. Yet at the same time, there are many independent bookstores that are doing relatively well. So what do we have here? A much more complicated picture than we thought we would end up with until quite recently. And book sales have not dropped. The second biggest change concerns us, the authors. I think the very notion of authorship is changing. Nowadays, authors have to interact more with their readers. Mostly, this is happening over the social media, on Twitter, Facebook. They are answering questions directly from the readers. The authors became more accessible. Yeah? On websites like Goodreads, they're constantly being interviewed by their readers. I think in the past, until recently, we had a more top-down understanding of authorship, whereas now everything is bottom-up and people are contributing, on blogs, publishing their own books. Somehow the gap between readers and writers became narrower and narrower. So the third biggest change is happening with readers. There was an interesting survey conducted by the New York Times. It turns out more than 80% of Americans believe there's a story in them, there's a book in them waiting to be written someday. And I think if they had conducted that survey in Turkey, that would be like 98%. Many people want to become writers, or they want to publish a book someday. This doesn't maybe increase people's sympathy for writers. Maybe it creates the opposite effect, but that's another issue. The important thing is, in the past, we had a more vertical hierarchy between author and reader. That is gone now. Everything is much more horizontal. And the fourth change that we're observing is happening in the very art of storytelling. And this is a change that excites me, intrigues me, but also to a certain extent worries me. And I'll tell you why. Storytelling today has acquired new roles, new meanings, and it is beginning to reach out to spaces that it couldn't touch before. Today, journalism has become much more story-centric. So when we look at digital media, written media, visual media, it is much more story-centric. Everything revolves around stories. Advertisement, branding, again, stories. But also big companies, the world of finance, asset management, more and more writers and storytellers are being invited to these big companies to talk about the art of storytelling. Politicians are looking for stories as well. It became very important before sending weapons to another country, having, in all international relations and sometimes major conflicts, the story became the main thing and makes a big, big difference. So what do we see when we put all these 4 axes together? Where is it going? Before answering, I think we have to take into consideration one final gap. These changes are not happening all around the world with the same intensity, at the same rhythm. So while we're observing these changes in other parts of the world, like Pakistan, India, these are huge markets, Turkey, Egypt, Nigeria, the conventional form of storytelling is still very, very strong. In my country, words can put you in trouble, but also words matter, books matter, stories matter. In India, there are interesting comparisons. One single copy is being read by more than 5 or 6 people. So books are not individual items. They're shared, they're discussed, people talk about books, and they do have an amazing impact in that regard as well. So by taking into account the bigger picture, where do we think this whole thing is going? I believe the prediction that the new models of storytelling or printing was going to swallow up the older forms, that prediction has failed. What we are seeing instead is the existence of the old and the new side by side. And for the foreseeable future, most probably for the next 50 years, we will be seeing these existing together. Therefore, instead of concentrating on purely the new technology and the new forms of storytelling, or instead of lamenting the demise of books, of the printed word, what we need to do, in my opinion, is to bring together, is to embrace together the old and the new at the same time. We have to bring together oral storytelling and the written storytelling. We have to match old, ancient, universal forms of storytelling with the new technologies. And we have to bear in mind that there are big cultural gaps, and these gaps threaten all of us. So when we develop our ways of storytelling, we must bear in mind the non-Western part of the world where things are happening differently. Now, why do we need stories? We do need stories for so many reasons, but first and foremost because stories enable us not to be ourselves. Stories enable us to empathize. There's research after research after research that shows us, both for young people and adults, the part of our brain that can empathize expands, is activated when we read stories. I also like to think that it's a transcendental experience. In the Eastern world, in the Middle Eastern literature, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid used to disguise himself as a beggar and walk on the streets of Baghdad to observe life from a different angle. Many Ottoman sultans used to do the same thing. Maybe they did it in order to further their power and check, who wasn't obeying the rules and punish him the next day. But I would also like to think they did it because they needed not to be themselves, even if for a few hours. They needed to transcend the limits of the self, and stories enable us to do this. And finally, why do we need stories today? Because we need an inner space. So many of us are so busy, constantly running from one place to another. Most of our time, most of our energy goes outside. But I do believe that the art of particularly for novelists, the genre of the novel is the loneliest form of art. The writer is alone when he or she is working. The reader of novels is alone. And from that lonely inner space to the reader's lonely inner space, a connection is made. Fascism is a collectivistic disease. People are always less tolerant, more reactionary when they are in the company of other people. We're always much more open-minded, more willing to understand, more willing to empathize when we're alone. I know many homophobic readers who can connect with a gay character in a book. I know many xenophobic readers who can love a minority member in a novel. But when they go out, when they start talking with their friends, then they change. So it is that individualistic space that the novel and the art of storytelling particularly targets. Without individuality, there's no creativity, there's no innovation. I think the faster our lives, the more interconnected we become, the deeper is our need for that inner space. So stories, whether we believe we live with angels and books on our shoulders or not, I think we must continue to believe that stories are here to stay, stories change, stories connect, and they will also help us to understand and hopefully heal some of the deepest gaps in our lives. Thank you.